The needle, a tiny silver fish, dipped and rose through the sea of blue silk. Eleanor Vance kept her stitches small and even, a line of perfect, disciplined soldiers marching along the hem of Mrs. Gable's mother of the bride dress. Her fingers, calloused and occasionally pricked, moved with a certainty that her heart had not felt in 5 years. Here, in her shop, she was not an object of pity. She was not the girl left at the altar. She was Ellie, the tailor, a woman who could mend what was torn and create beauty from bolts of plain cloth. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, poured through the large front window of Ellie's stitches and dreams. It warmed the old wooden floorboards and illuminated the rainbow of thread spools on the wall. The air smelled of lavender from the sachets she tucked into drawers, the faint, sharp scent of steam fabric, and the comforting aroma of old books from the shop next door. This space was her sanctuary, a world she had built one stitch at a time, a world where everything had its place, where chaos was kept neatly folded and stored away. "I just don't know how you do it, Ellie," Mrs. Gable said, her voice slightly muffled as she peered down at the hem. "My hands would shake so much. I'd make a mess of it." Ellie offered a small, practiced smile, her eyes never leaving her work. "It just takes patience." It was her standard answer. Patience was a muscle she had been forced to exercise until it was the strongest part of her. Patience in the face of whispers. Patience in the face of sympathetic, head-tilted glances at the grocery store. Patience while she waited for the memory of a white dress in an empty church to fade into something less sharp, less suffocating. "Well, you have the patience of a saint," Mrs. Gable continued, shifting her weight. "Are you sure this color is right? I worry it washes me out." Ellie paused, setting the needle carefully into the fabric. She looked up, her warm brown eyes assessing the periwinkle blue against Mrs. Gable's kind, worried face. "The color is lovely on you, Martha. It brings out the blue in your eyes. Once we get the fit just right, you will feel like a queen." She spoke with a quiet confidence she only ever felt when talking about fabric and thread. This was a language she understood. The language of people, however, remained a bewildering puzzle. A small bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, familiar sound that usually made Ellie smile. But the person who burst in was anything but cheerful. It was Sarah from the Sweet Haven Bakery next door, her cheeks flushed and a dusting of flour on her dark apron. She held the door open for a moment longer than necessary, letting in a gust of late morning air and the distant sound of a truck rumbling down Main Street. "Ellie, you are not going to believe this," Sarah said, her voice a breathless rush. She closed the door and the shop returned to its quiet hum. "There is a hum parked right outside the old hardware store. I have never seen anything like it in Havenwood. Not ever." Ellie calmly pinned the section she had just sewn. "Hello, Sarah. Is it a special kind of car?" "Special? Ellie, it's jet black and so shiny you can see your own terrified face in it. It looks like it belongs in a movie, not parked next to Mr. Henderson's pickup truck. The whole street is pretending not to stare." Sarah leaned against a cutting table, her eyes wide. "Everyone is trying to figure out who it is. Some think it's a developer coming to buy the old mill. Marianne thinks it's a celebrity who got lost on their way to the coast." Mrs. Gable twisted her body, trying to see out the window. "Oh, how exciting! We never get any excitement." Ellie felt a tiny, unwelcome prickle of anxiety. She disliked disruptions. She had curated her life in Havenwood to be as predictable as the changing seasons. The morning coffee rush at Sarah's bakery, the lunchtime lull, the way the afternoon sun hit the armchair in the corner of her shop. This car, this mystery, felt like a stone tossed into the placid surface of her well-ordered pond. "Maybe it's just someone passing through," Ellie suggested, her voice softer than she intended. She picked up her scissors to snip a loose thread, the cool weight of the steel familiar in her palm. "Passing through? Honey, people who drive cars like that don't pass through Havenwood. They pass over it," Sarah said, pulling a stray piece of lint from a bolt of wool. I have a weird feeling about it, you know?" Ellie knew. She knew all about weird feelings. For 5 years, she had lived with the constant, low-grade hum of one, the feeling that at any moment the floor could drop out from under her again. She had learned to ignore it, to push it down with the rhythmic work of her hands, with the simple satisfaction of a perfectly set sleeve. "Well, I'm sure we'll find out soon enough," Mrs. Gable said, her curiosity piqued. "The Havenwood grapevine is faster than any internet connection." Ellie finished the final stitch on the hem section. "All right, Martha, let's have you try walking a few steps. I want to see how it moves." As Mrs. Gable carefully paced the length of the shop, her face lit up with a genuine smile. The dress flowed beautifully, the periwinkle silk catching the light. For a moment, the strange car was forgotten. There was only the happy customer, the successful fitting, the quiet victory of a job well done. This was real. This was manageable. After Mrs. Gable had changed and left, promising to tell everyone at her book club about Ellie's miracle work, Sarah lingered. "You're not even a little bit curious?" she asked, leaning over the counter. "It's just a car, Sarah," Ellie replied, beginning to carefully fold the dress and lay it in a protective garment bag. Her fingers moved automatically, but her mind was replaying Sarah's words. "So shiny you can see your own terrified face in it." "It's not just a car, it's a statement," Sarah insisted. "It's like someone from another planet landed on Main Street." She sighed, running a hand through her messy bun. "Anyway, I have a batch of sourdough coming out of the oven. Just keep an eye out. Let me know if you see who it is." With another jingle of the bell, Sarah was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of sugar and yeast. The silence that settled in the shop felt different now. It was heavier, charged with an unspoken question. Ellie walked over to the front window, pretending to adjust a display of colorful scarves. Her heart was beating just a little too fast. She told herself it was foolish. It was a car, a simple, inanimate object. But then she saw it, parked across the street, just as Sarah had described. It was long and black and sleek, gleaming under the midday sun. It looked alien against the familiar, slightly faded brickwork of the town's buildings. It was the kind of car you saw in magazines, the kind that whispered of money and power, in a life so far removed from Havenwood it was almost imaginary. Her fingers tightened on the silk scarf she was holding. She watched as people walked by, their gaits slowing, their heads turning for a quick, furtive glance before they hurried on. The car was a disruption, a tear in the fabric of their ordinary day. A knot formed in Ellie's stomach. She hated tears. She spent her life mending them. Then the driver's side door opened. A polished black leather shoe, impossibly expensive, met the pavement. Then a leg clad in a perfectly tailored gray suit. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed, no. It was a silent, desperate plea. Not him. Please, not him. The man stood up and straightened his suit jacket. He ran a hand through his dark, perfectly styled hair. It was a gesture she had seen 1,000 times. In the high school hallway, across a table at the Havenwood diner, at the foot of her parents' porch, promising her father he would always take care of her. It was Thomas Ashford. The 5 years that had passed seemed to melt away in a single horrifying second. He looked older, his face leaner, his charm now polished to a high-gloss corporate sheen. But it was him. The ghost who haunted the quiet corners of her life was suddenly flesh and blood, standing 20 yards from her front door. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand, the one not strangling the scarf, flew to her mouth. She felt a wave of dizziness, and she gripped the edge of the window display to steady herself. He had not looked her way. His attention was fixed on the passenger door of the car. He walked around the front, his stride confident and smooth. He opened the door with a flourish, a gentlemanly act that felt like a sharp jab to Ellie's ribs. A slender, high-heeled shoe emerged first, followed by a woman with hair the color of platinum. She was beautiful in a sharp, intimidating way, dressed in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Ellie's monthly rent. A large, sparkling diamond glittered on her left hand as she took Thomas's hand to step out. His wife. The word slammed into Ellie's mind with the force of a physical blow. Of course he had a wife. A rich, beautiful wife who belonged with the expensive car and the tailored suit. A wife who was not a small-town tailor with calloused fingers and a broken heart stored in a cedar chest in her back room. Thomas closed the door and wrapped his arm around the woman's waist, pulling her close. He leaned down and said something that made her laugh, a tinkling, melodic sound that carried across the quiet street. Then Thomas laughed too. It was the same laugh, the same deep, joyful sound that had once been her favorite music in the world, the sound she had expected to hear echoing in the church on their wedding day. The sound that had been stolen from her, replaced by the rustle of a single sheet of paper, a note left on a velvet cushion where the ring should have been. He stood there, his arm around his beautiful wife, basking in the Havenwood sun as if he had every right to be there, as if he had not shattered a life in this very town, as if he had not turned Ellie Vance into a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at bridal showers. The jilted bride. Poor Ellie. The shop, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a glass cage. She was exposed, a butterfly pinned to a board. He would see her. Any second now he would turn his head, his eyes would scan the familiar storefronts, and they would land on her. He would see her standing here, and he would know. He would see the last 5 years of her life summed up in a single pitying glance. The silk scarf slipped from her numb fingers. The scissors she had tucked into the pocket of her apron after Sarah left felt impossibly heavy. She pulled them out, her movements stiff and robotic, intending to place them on the cutting table, but her hand was shaking. A tremor started in her fingers and worked its way up her arm. Across the street, Thomas pointed at the old bookstore, a nostalgic smile on his handsome face. He was telling his wife a story, probably about their town, about his past. A past from which Ellie had been surgically, brutally excised. Her fingers lost their grip. The steel scissors fell, tumbling end over end through the silent, sunlit air. They hit the wooden floor with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed the breaking of something deep inside her. Ellie didn't flinch. She just stood there, frozen behind the glass, watching the man she had once loved laugh with his new life, his new wife in the ruins of their old one. The silver scissors hit the worn wooden floor with a clatter that was too loud in the quiet shop. The sound jolted Eleanor Vance from her trance, but her eyes remained fixed on the scene across the street. Thomas Ashford. He was laughing, a sound she once thought was the music of her future. His arm was wrapped possessively around a woman who looked like she was carved from ice and diamonds. A perfect stranger wearing the life that should have been hers. Ellie's breath hitched, trapped somewhere in her chest. The bright afternoon sun seemed to mock her, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air of her little shop, each one a tiny spotlight on her frozen form. Her fingers, usually so nimble and sure, were numb. The half-pinned hem of Mrs. Gable's floral dress felt like a foreign object under her touch. The scent of lavender and steam fabric, usually a comfort, was suddenly suffocating. She could feel the ghost of another fabric, the heavy silk and delicate lace of her wedding dress, the dress that still waited in a cedar chest in the back room. An unfinished monument to an unfinished life. The memory, a monster she kept chained in the deepest part of her mind, broke free. It crashed over her, not as a gentle wave of nostalgia, but as a violent, cold torrent. She was 23 again, standing in the small vestry of the town church. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and beeswax candles. Her own reflection stared back at her from an old clouded mirror. Her chestnut hair was intricately pinned, her warm brown eyes bright with a future she could almost taste. The dress, a creation of her own hands, felt like a second skin. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever made. She had felt beautiful, whole. Her father was supposed to walk her down the aisle in 10 minutes. But Sarah, her maid of honor, had found the note first. It was propped against a vase of roses on a small table, a single folded piece of cream-colored paper with her name on it. Ellie remembered the crisp, cold feel of it between her trembling fingers. She remembered the world narrowing to the neat, familiar slant of Thomas's handwriting. The words were few, but they were razors. "I can't do this, Ellie. I'm sorry." That was all. No explanation, no grand tragedy, just a simple, devastating failure of courage. The sound that escaped her then wasn't a scream. It was a hollow, breathless gasp, the sound of a dream shattering against the hard floor of reality. She had stood there, motionless, while Sarah frantically tried to talk to her, while her father's face crumpled, while the hopeful murmurs of the guests outside turned to confused whispers. The weight of the dress became unbearable, a beautiful cage she couldn't escape. Someone, she could not remember who, had eventually guided her out a back door, away from the 200 pairs of pitying eyes. Now, 5 years later, those eyes were on her again. The clatter of the scissors had been loud enough to draw the attention of Mr. Henderson, who was sweeping the pavement in front of his hardware store. He paused, his gaze lingering on her shop window, his expression of familiar, sad curiosity. A moment later, two women walking past slowed their pace, their heads turning in unison. They whispered behind their hands, but Ellie didn't need to hear the words. She had been hearing them in her head for half a decade. Poor Ellie. That poor abandoned girl, still here mending other people's lives while her own lay in tatters. A cold dread spread through her limbs, heavier than any fatigue. This was what she had always feared. His return was not just about him. It was about the town remembering. It was about the scab being ripped from a wound that had never truly healed. She felt a desperate urge to run to the back room, lock the door, and pull the unfinished wedding dress from its chest. To bury her face in the fabric and finally let out the scream she had swallowed on her wedding day. But then, a different feeling flickered to life within her. It was a small, stubborn ember of defiance that had kept her going all these years. It was the reason she hadn't sold the shop and fled Havenwood. This was her home. This shop, Stitches and Dreams, was the one thing she had built for herself from the wreckage. She would not let him turn her into a ghost in her own life. She would not hide. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to bend down and pick up the scissors. The cool metal was a familiar weight in her palm. She took a deep, steadying breath, her gaze moving from the couple across the street and back to the task at hand. She carefully placed the scissors back in their velvet-lined tray. Her movements were deliberate, almost unnaturally slow, a conscious effort to reclaim control over her own body. Just then, the little bell above her shop door chimed. Mrs. Gable, a woman with kind eyes and a penchant for town gossip, stepped inside. Her smile was a little too bright, her eyes a little too wide with unspoken sympathy. "Eleanor, dear," she began, her voice gentle, "I just came to see if my dress might be ready a day early." No rush, of course. Ellie knew it wasn't about the dress. Mrs. Gable had seen the car. She had heard the whispers. She was here to check on the town's fragile centerpiece. Ellie forced a smile that felt brittle, like it might crack and fall from her face. "It's nearly done, Martha, just finishing the hem." Her voice was steady, a small miracle. She gestured to the dress on its mannequin. Mrs. Gable's eyes flicked toward the window for a fraction of a second before returning to Ellie. She walked over and placed a warm, wrinkled hand on Ellie's arm. The touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a brand, marking her as an object of pity. "You're a strong girl, Ellie," she said softly, her voice thick with meaning. "Always have been. Don't you let anything trouble you." Ellie's throat tightened. She wanted to pull her arm away. She wanted to scream that she didn't want to be strong. She just wanted to be normal. Instead, she nodded, the smile still frozen on her face. "Thank you, Martha. I'll have this ready for you by 5. After Mrs. Gable left, the silence in the shop returned, but it was different now. It was charged, heavy with the weight of the entire town's collective memory. Ellie felt pinned, not just by the stares from the street, but by 5 years of kindness that felt like a cage. They had propped her up with their sympathy, wrapped her in a cocoon of gentle sorrow. And in doing so, they had kept her frozen in time, forever the jilted bride. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. Lunchtime. The thought of food was nauseating, but the thought of staying in the shop, a fish in a glass bowl, was worse. An idea formed in her mind, a terrifying, reckless impulse. She had to go out. She had to sit in the Havenwood diner, the social heart of the town, and eat her lunch as if it were any other day. She had to show them, and maybe even herself, that she was not a fragile doll that would shatter at the first scene of her past. Her heart began to pound a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. Her inner voice was a chorus of fear. "Don't go. Stay here. It's safe here. What if he's there? What if everyone stares?" But the small, defiant ember flared brighter. If she hid now, she would be hiding for the rest of her life. She walked to the back, untied her work apron, and smoothed down her simple cotton dress. In the small mirror by the door, she saw a pale woman with woody, haunted eyes. A dusting of freckles stood out against her colorless skin. She pinched her cheeks. a futile attempt to bring some life back into her face. She took her small purse from a hook, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. This is ridiculous, she thought. It's just lunch. But it felt like walking into a battle without armor. The walk from her shop to the diner was only 2 blocks, but it felt like miles. Every passing car seemed to slow down. Every person on the sidewalk seemed to watch her. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on the familiar red and white sign of the diner. She could feel the stares on her back, on the side of her face. They weren't malicious. They were worse. They were pitying. They saw her not as Ellie the seamstress or Ellie their neighbor, but as Ellie the tragedy. She reached the diner door, her hand hovering over the cool metal handle for a long moment. She could still turn back. She could plead a headache and lock herself in her shop until the sun went down. But the image of Thomas laughing across the street flashed in her mind, the condescending pity in Mrs. Gable's eyes. She pushed the door open. The cheerful jingle of the bell was like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of her mind. The usual lunchtime hum of the diner, a mixture of clattering cutlery, sizzling bacon, and low conversation, seemed to dip for a single, excruciating second as she stepped inside. Every head seemed to turn. She saw faces she had known her entire life. Mr. Peterson from the bank, Sarah's mother, a group of farmhands from the Blackwood property, their faces smudged with dirt. Their expressions ranged from surprise to open sympathy. Ellie's face burned. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. But she kept walking, her chin held a little higher than usual. She slid into an empty booth in the far corner, one with its back to the wall, giving her a view of the entire room while offering a sliver of security. A waitress, a teenager named Chloe, approached with a nervous smile. "Hi, Ellie. The usual?" Chloe asked, her voice hushed. The usual was a turkey sandwich and an iced tea. It was what Ellie had ordered every Tuesday for the last 3 years. But today, the thought of trying to swallow food felt impossible. "Just a coffee for now, Chloe." "Thank you," Ellie managed to say. Her own voice sounded distant. Chloe nodded and scurried away, clearly uncomfortable. Ellie was left alone in the booth, the red vinyl sticking to her back. She picked up the plastic-coated menu, not to read it, but to have something to hide behind. Her hands were trembling so violently that the menu shook, the list of burgers and milkshakes blurring into an incomprehensible mess. She gripped it tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Just breathe," she told herself, "in and out. You are just a woman having coffee. Nothing is wrong." She stared at the menu, her eyes unseeing. Her ears, however, were working perfectly. She could hear the conversations starting up again. But they were lower now, more subdued. She could feel the glances, quick and furtive, like birds darting in her peripheral vision. She felt utterly, completely exposed. Each minute stretched into an eternity. The coffee arrived, and she wrapped her cold hands around the warm ceramic mug, trying to absorb its heat, trying to stop the trembling. She took a sip. It was bitter. She focused on the small details of the diner, the swirl of cream in her coffee, a crack in the Formica tabletop, the low hum of the refrigerator, anything to anchor herself in the present and keep the memories at bay. She was surviving. It wasn't graceful, and it wasn't comfortable, but she was doing it. She was sitting in the middle of her greatest fear, and she hadn't fallen apart. A tiny, fragile sense of victory began to bloom in her chest. Maybe she could do this. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. And then the bell above the door jingled again. The sound cut through the low murmur of the diner, sharp and clear. A sudden, profound silence fell over the room. It was not the brief lull that had greeted her arrival. This was a complete and total cessation of all sound and movement. Cutlery stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died in an instant. Every single person in the Havenwood diner froze. Slowly, as if moving through water, Ellie lifted her head. Her eyes traveled from the sugar dispenser on her table, past the shocked faces of the other patrons, to the entrance. Thomas Ashford stood there holding the door open. He was wearing a suit that cost more than her shop's monthly rent. Beside him, Isabella Sterling Ashford surveyed the room with a look of bored superiority. Their presence was a physical force, sucking all the air, all the warmth, all the simple, small-town comfort right out of the room, leaving behind a cold, breathless vacuum. And their eyes, both of them, landed directly on her. The bell above the diner door was a cheerful, innocent sound. But as Thomas and Isabella stepped inside, it felt like a death knell. A wave of silence rolled through the room, starting from the booths nearest the entrance and spreading outward like a stain. Conversations faltered. Forks paused midway to mouths. Every head turned, first to the glamorous couple, then, inevitably, to the small table where Eleanor Vance sat alone. Ellie felt the collective weight of their gazes, of physical pressure on her shoulders. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible, to melt through the red vinyl of the booth and disappear into the floor. Thomas looked handsome, devastatingly so, in a charcoal gray suit that must have cost more than her shop's monthly rent. But his familiar, easy smile was tight at the edges. His eyes, the same warm hazelnut she had once thought held the entire world, darted around the room, refusing to land anywhere for more than a second. Beside him, his wife Isabella was a vision of cool, untouchable perfection. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into an elegant knot, and her cream-colored dress was so pristine it seemed to repel the very air of the diner, with its scent of fried bacon and brewing coffee. She surveyed the room not with curiosity, but with the faint, dismissive air of a queen inspecting the servants' quarters. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her hands, which could guide a needle through the most delicate silk, were trembling so badly she had to clench them into fists in her lap. She forced her eyes down to the menu, the words blurring into meaningless black squiggles. She could feel them moving, could hear the soft scuff of Isabella's expensive shoes on the checkered linoleum. They weren't taking a table by the window, or one in a quiet back corner. No, they were sliding into the booth directly across the narrow aisle from her. The placement was so deliberate, so pointed, it stole the air from her lungs. It was a declaration. They were not hiding. They were not ashamed. They were putting themselves on display. And by extension, they were putting her on display too. The woman who was left behind. The town's tragic little fixture. Ellie could feel the pity from the other patrons, a suffocating blanket of it. She saw Martha, the waitress, hesitate with a coffee pot in her hand, her kind face etched with worry. She saw old Mr. Henderson peer over his newspaper, his eyes sad. This was what she had feared for far long years. Not the anger, not the confrontation, but the pity, the quiet, head-shaking sorrow that made her feel like a broken thing. Her mind screamed at her to leave. Just stand up, drop a few dollars on the table, and walk out. Flee. But her legs felt like lead. Her pride, a stubborn, foolish thing, was at war with her panic. If she ran, they would see her run. Isabella would see her run. And that, somehow, felt like a deeper failure than staying. So she sat, a statue carved from pure anxiety, and pretended to read about the daily specials. She could hear the low murmur of their voices. Thomas's deeper timbre, a sound that once soothed her, now made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Isabella's laugh, a light tinkling sound, cut through the diner's hush. It was a sound that didn't belong here. It was too polished, too practiced. Ellie risked a glance. Thomas was studiously examining his own menu, his shoulders hunched slightly. He wouldn't look at her. He was a coward. That much hadn't changed. He had been a coward when he left a note on a pillow instead of facing her. And he was a coward now, hiding behind his new wife in a wall of feigned indifference. The realization didn't bring anger, only a profound, hollow ache. The man she had planned to build a life with was a stranger. Or perhaps he had always been this person, and she had simply refused to see it. Then came the scrape of a chair from the booth across the aisle. Ellie's stomach plummeted. She didn't have to look up. She knew. The click of heels on the floor, slow, deliberate, was coming closer. One step, 2 steps. They stopped right beside her table. The scent of an expensive floral perfume invaded her space, overpowering the familiar comfort of coffee and syrup. It was suffocating. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Ellie lifted her head. Isabella Sterling Ashford was standing over her, a small, perfectly practiced smile on her lips. Her eyes, however, were cold and sharp, conducting a swift, brutal assessment of Ellie's simple cotton dress, her calloused fingers, the way her chestnut hair was escaping its messy bun. "Eleanor, isn't it?" Isabella's voice was smooth as silk, but it carried, pitched just right for the surrounding tables to hear every word. Thomas has told me so much about you. The use of her full name felt like a slap. No one called her Eleanor except for official documents. She was Ellie to everyone in Havenwood. The formality was a weapon, creating an instant distance, establishing a hierarchy. Ellie's throat was tight and dry. She managed a small, jerky nod. A word, any word, was trapped behind the lump of fear lodged in her throat. "We're just in town for a few days," Isabella continued, resting one hand with perfectly manicured, blood-red nails on the edge of Ellie's table. The gesture was casual, proprietary, as if she were claiming this space too. "Thomas has some old business to wrap up, and we thought we might look at some property. The air here is so fresh." She let the word hang there, as if the very concept of fresh air were a novelty. Ellie's gaze flickered past her, pleading with Thomas to intervene, to say something, to stop this. But he was staring intently at the salt shaker on his table, turning it over and over in his hands. He was a million miles away. He had abandoned her at the altar, and now he was abandoning her all over again, right here, in the middle of the Havenwood diner. Isabella followed her gaze, and a flicker of something, triumph perhaps, crossed her face before being smoothed away. She turned her attention back to Ellie, her smile widening slightly. She looked around the cozy, worn-in diner, at the red vinyl booths patched with tape and the faded photographs of the town on the walls. Her eyes finally landed back on Ellie, taking in her simple, handmade apron, peeking out from her tote bag on the seat beside her. "It's just so lovely seeing you," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension that was meant to sound like sympathy. "And so quaint." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting its meaning fester. "That you're still here, in this little town." The silence in the diner was now absolute. Every person was frozen, listening. This was no longer a private conversation. It was a public execution. Isabella leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to catch. "Still, what is it you do again?" She tilted her head, a caricature of forgetfulness. "Oh, that's right, mending things for people." The words struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow. Mending things. It made her craft, her shop, her entire life sound like a pathetic hobby. It reduced her resilience to a sad little chore. She wasn't a businesswoman, a designer, an artist who could breathe new life into fabric. She was just the girl who stayed behind to patch up other people's clothes while the man who promised her the world went off to conquer it. A hot, prickling shame washed over her, starting in her chest and spreading up her neck to her cheeks. She could feel the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. The clatter of the kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator, it all faded into a dull roar in her ears. All she could see was Isabella's perfectly made-up face, her eyes glittering with a victory Ellie hadn't even known they were competing for. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, to say anything at all. But no sound came out. Her voice was gone. Her strength, the quiet dignity she had so carefully constructed over the past 5 years, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the raw, gaping wound of her abandonment, torn open for the entire town to see. A single hot tear escaped and slid down her cheek. She furiously tried to blink the others back, but they welled up, blurring Isabella's triumphant face into a cruel watercolor painting. She was pinned by the condescending smile of the woman who had taken her place, pinned by the silent watching eyes of her neighbors, pinned by the terrible, suffocating weight of their pity. Her gaze, desperate for an anchor, for any sign of support, found Thomas one last time. He finally looked up, his hazel eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. She saw a flicker of guilt, a shadow of pain, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He broke eye contact immediately, his focus dropping back to the table, to his hands, to anything but the woman he had shattered. That single, deliberate act of looking away was the final twist of the knife. It told her everything. He was not going to save her. He was letting this happen. Tears welling in her eyes, Ellie was speechless, pinned by the pitying stares of everyone in the diner, with Thomas refusing to meet her gaze. The world had shrunk to the four corners of her small table. The cheerful red vinyl of the booth felt slick and cold against her back. Every sound in the Havenwood diner was magnified, a cruel symphony conducted by her humiliation. The scrape of a fork on a ceramic plate, the low, mournful hum of the beverage cooler, the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Each noise was a stone thrown into the silent, stagnant pond of her shame. Isabella's words still hung in the air, glittering and sharp like broken glass. Quaint, mending other people's clothes. A little town. The phrases circled in Ellie's mind, vultures picking at a wound that had never truly healed. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. She could feel a tremor starting in her fingers, a telltale sign of the dam about to break. She focused on her untouched glass of water, on the way the condensation traced a wet ring on the Formica tabletop. If she looked up, she would see them. The faces. Mrs. Gable from the post office, her mouth a perfect O of pity. Young Mr. Henderson, the high school history teacher, quickly looking away as if he'd seen something indecent. And Thomas. She could feel his presence without seeing him, a void where there was once a universe. He wouldn't meet her eyes. 5 years of silence, and he couldn't grant her the simple dignity of a glance. He just sat there, a handsome statue, next to his polished, perfect wife, letting her tear Ellie apart with a smile. Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and acidic. She blinked rapidly, trying to force them back, to dissolve them before they could fall and complete her disgrace. A single tear would be a victory for Isabella. It would confirm everything she had implied, that Ellie was stuck, that she was broken, that she was still the girl left at the altar, waiting in a town that had become her cage. Her breath hitched. The urge to flee was a physical force, a hand pushing against the small of her back. She imagined herself stumbling out of the booth, knocking over her water, running past the staring eyes and out into the street where she could finally shatter. But her legs felt like lead. She was pinned to the spot, a butterfly on a display board, her wings still and useless. Then a sound broke the spell. It was not a whisper or a cough. It was the distinct, solid scrape of a wooden chair against the checkerboard linoleum floor. The sound came from a corner booth, a place shrouded in the diner's afternoon shadows. A ripple of curiosity passed through the room, a subtle shift in the collective gaze. Ellie, trapped in her own vortex of misery, barely registered it. Her focus was on not crying, on maintaining the fragile shell of her composure for just a few more seconds. But the movement continued. Heavy, deliberate footsteps began to cross the diner. They were slow, unhurried, each tread of a worn work boot landing with quiet confidence. The footsteps grew closer. They were not heading for the door or the counter. They were heading for her. Through the shimmering blur of her unshed tears, Ellie saw a figure approach. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans. She recognized him vaguely. He was a farmhand from Blackwood Farm, the sprawling property on the edge of town. She'd seen him at the general store buying supplies, his hands always looking too large and calloused for the small items he handled. He had sun-bleached dark blonde hair and eyes that always seemed to be watching from a distance. He never spoke much. His name was Jack, she thought. Jack Riley. He stopped beside her table. The entire diner held its breath. What was he doing? Was he going to offer a clumsy word of comfort, adding another layer of pity to her burden? Was he some friend of Thomas's, sent to smooth things over? The possibilities flickered through her mind, each one more horrifying than the last. Isabella's perfect smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. She looked from the approaching stranger to Ellie, her brow furrowed. Thomas finally looked up, his expression one of pure, unguarded bewilderment. Jack did not speak. He did not look at the faces watching him. His gaze was fixed, first with a cool, unreadable intensity on Isabella, and then it softened almost imperceptibly as it landed on Ellie. He didn't ask for permission. He simply slid into the booth beside her. The vinyl cushion groaned under his weight, and suddenly the small space felt crowded, but not in a suffocating way. It felt occupied, defended. His presence was a solid wall between her and the rest of the room. Then he did something that sent a jolt through Ellie's entire body. He put his arm around her shoulders. It was not a tentative gesture. It was firm, sure, and impossibly warm. The weight of it was grounding, an anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions. Through the thin fabric of her blouse, she could feel the solid muscle of his arm, the strength in the hand that rested on her shoulder. He smelled of fresh air, of hay and damp earth, a clean, honest scent that cut through the diner's greasy air. For a single breathless moment, the frantic pounding in her chest slowed to a steady, heavy beat. She could feel the solid reality of him beside her, a stark contrast to the ghost of the man sitting across from them. Her mind reeled. This was madness. She didn't know this man. He didn't know her. Why was he doing this? Why was he touching her with such casual intimacy in front of the entire town? She was too stunned to pull away, too exhausted to protest. She simply sat there, frozen under the warm weight of his arm, her mind a blank slate of confusion. Jack turned his head, his gaze moving from Ellie to lock directly onto Thomas and Isabella. The condescending smirk had vanished completely from Isabella's face, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. Thomas looked as if he'd been struck. His charismatic charm had evaporated, leaving him looking young and uncertain. The power dynamic at the table had been shattered and reassembled in a matter of seconds. Into the thick, charged silence, Jack spoke. His voice was low and calm, yet it carried effortlessly through the quiet diner. It was a voice that was accustomed to being heard over the rumble of machinery, clear and direct. "Sorry I'm late, honey," he said. "The tractor gave me some trouble." Honey. The word dropped into the silence like a stone, sending ripples of shock across the entire room. It was so simple, so domestic, so utterly unbelievable. It was an earthquake in a single syllable. Ellie's mind stuttered. Honey? Did he just call her honey? Her? The pitied, abandoned Ellie Vance? The absurdity of it was breathtaking. The tractor gave me some trouble. It was the most mundane, most normal excuse imaginable. And in that moment, it was the most powerful weapon she could have ever wished for. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, glorious, impossible lie. A lie that painted a whole new picture for the avidly watching audience. In this new picture, Ellie wasn't a tragic figure pining over her lost love. She was a woman who had moved on. A woman who was waiting for her partner. A hardworking man delayed by the practicalities of his life. A man who sat beside her now, his arm wrapped protectively around her, claiming her as his. The collective gasp of the diner was almost audible. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died in mid-sentence. All eyes were on their table, but the pity was gone. It had been replaced by something else entirely, a potent mixture of shock, confusion, and raw, unadulterated curiosity. This was a twist no one had seen coming. Ellie's gaze flickered to Isabella. The woman's face was a study in cracking composure. Her perfectly painted lips were parted slightly, her sharp eyes wide with an emotion that looked suspiciously like fury. She had orchestrated this entire scene to establish her dominance, to put Ellie firmly in her place as a relic of the past. And this quiet, unknown farmhand had dismantled her entire performance with a single sentence. Thomas was even more transparent. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish. He stared at Jack, then at Ellie, then back at Jack. Disbelief warred with a flicker of something darker in his eyes. It looked like jealousy. The realization sent another shock through Ellie, a small, triumphant spark in the midst of her confusion. The man who had discarded her without a second thought now looked possessive, thrown off balance by the idea that she might belong to someone else. Ellie herself felt like she was floating somewhere outside her own body, watching a play she had no role in writing. Her mind was a frantic scramble of questions. Who was this man? Why was he risking his own reputation, inserting himself into her drama? He was a newcomer. He didn't owe her anything. Yet here he was, fabricating a relationship with a conviction that was staggering. His thumb moved in a slow, soothing circle on her shoulder, a small, private gesture in a very public performance. The simple touch felt more real than anything else that had happened that day. It was a silent message. I'm here. Stay with me. Before anyone could recover, Before a single word could be spoken to challenge the beautiful, audacious lie, Jack moved again. He leaned in closer. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage. She could see the fine lines around his intense blue eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. The scent of him, that earthy, clean smell, filled her senses. She thought he was going to whisper something, an explanation, a plan. But he didn't speak. Instead, with the entire town of Havenwood as his witness, Jack Riley leaned in and gently, deliberately, kissed her forehead. It was not a lover's kiss. It was not passionate or demanding. It was something else entirely. It was a seal, a benediction, a quiet, profound statement. The touch of his lips on her skin was brief, but it sent a cascade of warmth through her, chasing away the icy chill of humiliation. It was a touch that said, "You are not alone. You are not pitiable. You are cared for." The diner erupted in a fresh wave of silent, open-mouthed shock. If his words had been an earthquake, the kiss was the aftershock that brought the whole structure down. It was too intimate, too tender to be a simple prank. It looked real. It felt real. Ellie's eyes fluttered closed for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, Jack was already pulling back, his expression calm, as if kissing a near stranger in the middle of a crowded diner was the most natural thing in the world. He kept his arm around her, a solid, unmovable presence. The lingering warmth on her forehead was the only thing she could feel. It was a single point of heat in a world that had gone numb. The sounds of the diner, the faces of the patrons, the furious glare from Isabella, the dumbfounded stare from Thomas. All of it faded into a distant, unimportant blur. There was only the feeling of his lips on her skin, the weight of his arm on her shoulders, and the overwhelming, deafening shock that left her utterly, completely speechless. The light pressure of his lips on her forehead was like a brand. It was not a kiss of passion, but a seal, a public declaration of something that did not exist. For a heartbeat, the entire Havenwood diner was suspended in absolute silence. The only sound was the frantic, trapped bird of Ellie's own pulse in her ears. She felt frozen, a statue in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Her gaze was locked on the checkered tablecloth, unable to look at Thomas, unable to look at Isabella, and most certainly unable to look at the stranger beside her. Jack Riley pulled back slowly, his expression unreadable. He did not look at Ellie. Instead, his calm blue eyes swept across the diner, meeting the stunned gazes of a dozen familiar faces. He seemed completely unaffected by the thick atmosphere of astonishment he had just created. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He reached into the back pocket of his worn jeans, pulling out a creased leather wallet. With a fluid motion, he tossed a few bills onto the table of his now abandoned corner booth. They fluttered down next to a half-empty coffee cup. Then his attention returned to Ellie. His large, warm hand, the one that had been a steady weight on her shoulder, slid down her arm. His fingers gently but firmly closed around her wrist. The touch was a jolt, an anchor in the dizzying whirlpool of her thoughts. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and meant only for her. It was not a question. It was a soft-spoken command, a promise of escape. Ellie could not form a word. Her throat was tight, her mind a blank slate wiped clean by shock. She could only gnaw a barely perceptible movement. As he stood, he gently pulled her up with him. She felt weightless, a marionette whose strings he now held. Her legs felt unsteady, like they might buckle beneath her. His grip on her wrist was the only thing keeping her upright as they started to move. They walked past the tables of gawking patrons. Whispers erupted behind them, like the rustling of dry leaves. Eyes followed their every step. Ellie kept her head down, her chestnut hair falling forward to shield her burning face. She could feel the collective stare of the town on her back, a physical weight of curiosity and judgment. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Isabella Sterling Ashford. The woman was on her feet, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her face, usually a mask of cool superiority, was twisted into a snarl of pure, undiluted fury. Her mouth was open as if to shout something, but no sound came out. Thomas remained seated, paralyzed. He looked from his enraged wife to Ellie's retreating back, his handsome face a canvas of confusion and a flicker of something she couldn't name. He looked lost, a man who had instigated a storm and was now shocked to find himself in the rain. He made no move to stop them. He simply watched, a spectator in the demolition of a life he had once sworn to build. The bell above the diner door jingled, a bright, cheerful sound that was utterly at odds with the turmoil inside. Sheesh. Then they were outside on the familiar pavement of Main Street. The cool afternoon air hit Ellie's face, a welcome shock that began to clear the fog from her mind. The scent of rain-dampened asphalt in the distant hum of traffic filled her senses. Jack did not release her wrist until they were several paces away from the diner's large front window. When his warmth finally left her skin, Ellie stumbled back a step, wrapping her arms around herself. The dam of her composure broke. A flood of questions, accusations, and raw panic surged through her. She finally looked up at him, truly looked at the man who had just thrown a grenade into her life. His dark blonde hair was bleached by the sun, and his blue eyes were the color of a deep, calm lake. There were fine lines around them, crinkles from smiling or squinting into the sun. He was just a man, a farmhand she had seen once or twice at the market, a stranger. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It came out as a broken croak. "What did you do?" He met her frantic gaze without flinching. He simply stood there, his hands now resting loosely in his pockets, his posture relaxed. He seemed like the calmest person in the entire world, while Ellie felt like she was splintering apart. "Why would you do that?" she demanded, her voice gaining a sliver of strength fueled by rising hysteria. "Everyone was staring. They all saw you. They all think—" She couldn't finish the sentence. What did they think? That after 5 years of being Havenwood's heartbroken spinster, she suddenly had a secret lover? That the quiet, unassuming Tailor was leading some kind of double life? The thought was mortifying, a new and terrible brand of humiliation. "I know," he said simply. His voice was even, patient. "You know," she repeated, incredulous. You can't just walk up to a complete stranger and pretend to be her boyfriend. You can't just kiss someone." Her hand flew to her forehead, where she could still feel the phantom touch of his lips. Her cheeks burned with a fresh wave of shame. "Who are you?" "My name is Jack Riley," he answered, as if that explained everything. "I work out at Blackwood Farm." "I don't care where you work," Ellie snapped, the sound of her own sharp tone surprising her. "I care why you just turned my entire life into even more of a circus than it already was. Isabella, Thomas, they were tearing me apart in there, and you just made it 1,000 times worse." Tears of frustration and anger pricked at the corners of her eyes. She fought them back fiercely. She had shed enough tears over Thomas Ashford to last a lifetime. Jack's expression softened slightly. A hint of empathy entered his steady blue eyes. "I saw that," he said quietly. "I saw how she was talking to you. I saw him sitting there, letting it happen." He took a small step closer but stopped when she instinctively flinched. He held his ground, giving her space. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he continued, his voice low and firm. "No one deserves to be made to feel small in front of a room full of people, especially not by someone who wronged them." Ellie stared at him, the wind knocked out of her sails by his simple, direct statement. She had expected an apology, an excuse, maybe even a flippant remark. She had not expected this quiet, resolute defense of her dignity. For 5 years, she had been the subject of pity, of whispered gossip, of knowing smiles. No one had ever been angry on her behalf. No one had ever stepped in. "So you decided to what? Rescue me?" she asked, her voice laced with a bitter skepticism she couldn't hide. "By creating an even bigger scene? By telling a lie so enormous that the entire town will be talking about it for months?" "Yes," he said, without a trace of hesitation. His directness was disarming. "Ellie, they were already talking. They've been talking for 5 years. They were talking about the woman Thomas Ashford left at the altar. They were pitying you." He let the word hang in the air between them. Pity, the one thing she despised more than anything. "Now," he said, his gaze unwavering, "they'll be talking about the woman who moved on. The woman who has someone else. Let's give them something else to talk about." His logic was so simple, so audacious, that it left her speechless again. He wasn't trying to fix her past. He was trying to rewrite her present. He was offering her a different story, a new narrative, to replace the tired, tragic one that had defined her for so long. The idea was terrifying. It was deceptive. It was a lie. But a small, desperate part of her heart fluttered with a strange and unfamiliar feeling. It was a flicker of hope. She thought of Isabella's smug, condescending smile. She thought of the cold satisfaction in her eyes while she had picked at Ellie's life like a vulture. She thought of the suffocating silence of the diner, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes filled with pity. Jack was right. That was her reality. And what he had just done, as shocking and insane as it was, had shattered that reality completely. The pity was gone, replaced by stunned confusion. In a strange, twisted way, it felt like a victory. "They'll ask questions," Ellie said, her mind racing, trying to find the flaw, the inevitable point where this insane plan would collapse. "My friends, my customers. Sarah from the bakery will have a million questions. Mrs. Gable will want to know every detail. They'll want to know how we met, how long we've been seeing each other, why I never said anything." The logistics of the lie were overwhelming. "We'll figure it out," Jack replied calmly. He made it sound as simple as fixing a fence post or changing a tire, as if manufacturing an entire relationship history was a straightforward task. Ellie shook her head, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of pure exasperation. "This is crazy. You're crazy." A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his whole face, softening the intensity in his eyes. "Maybe a little," he admitted, "but it worked. She stopped talking to you. He had to watch you walk out with someone else. Right now in that diner, you're not the woman he left behind. You're the one that got away." The one that got away. The phrase echoed in the quiet corners of her heart. It was a role she had never imagined for herself. She had always been the one left, the one discarded. The thought of Thomas seeing her in this new light as someone desirable, someone who had found happiness without him, was a potent and dizzying fantasy. It was a petty and vengeful thought, and she was ashamed of it. But it was there nonetheless, a spark of warmth in the cold misery of the last 5 years. She looked down Main Street towards her little shop, Stitches and Dreams. It was her sanctuary, her safe place. But she knew that when she walked back in there, it would be different. The pitying glances would be replaced with curious ones. The quiet sympathy would be replaced with probing questions. Her sanctuary was no longer safe from the story this man had just invented. An old, dusty pickup truck was parked a few yards away. It was a deep forest green, with a few dings and scratches on the side, and a layer of dirt on the tires that spoke of country roads and hard work. It was his truck. It looked as sturdy and unassuming as he did. He followed her gaze. "You look like you could use a ride home," he said softly. "You're shaking." She looked down at her hands and realized he was right. They were trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline from the confrontation, the shock of his intervention, it was all catching up to her. She felt exhausted, drained to her very soul. The idea of walking home, of potentially running into more people, of having to field more questions, was unbearable. She looked back at him, her mind a war between a desperate need to escape and a deep-seated fear of this stranger and the web he was weaving around her. She saw no deceit in his eyes, no hidden agenda. She saw only a quiet strength and a sincere, steady gaze that seemed to understand her turmoil without her having to speak a word. He was offering her a lifeline, a temporary reprieve from the storm. But taking it meant stepping further into the lie. He must have seen the conflict on her face. He took a breath, his expression serious. He wasn't pushing her. He was simply offering. The choice was hers. And in that moment, he gave her back the one thing Thomas and Isabella had tried to take from her in the diner, a sense of agency. "I know this is a lot," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me." He paused, his blue eyes holding hers, searching for something. "But they will be watching when you leave. They might even follow you." He gestured subtly with his head back towards the diner. "We started this. We should probably finish it, at least for today." He extended his hand, not to touch her, but as an open, honest gesture. I'll drive you home. We don't have to talk. You don't have to decide anything right now. His gaze was so direct, so sincere, it felt impossible to look away. For now, he asked, his voice a low, earnest plea that cut through all her fear and confusion. Can you just pretend to trust me? The engine of Jack's old truck hummed a low, steady rhythm. It was the only sound between them, a mechanical heartbeat in the suffocating silence. Ellie stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar storefronts of Havenwood slide by in a blur of brick and glass. Her own reflection was a ghostly image superimposed over the world she knew. A pale face, wide eyes, and lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. The question he had asked hung in the air, thick and heavy. For now, can you just pretend to trust me? It was an impossible request. Trust was a currency she no longer dealt in, a language she had forgotten how to speak. They reached the edge of town, where the houses grew farther apart and the fields opened up. Jack didn't drive her home. Instead, he pulled over on a quiet dirt road overlooking Miller's Pond, the water glittering under the afternoon sun. He cut the engine. The sudden quiet was even louder than the noise. Ellie could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed on the water, tracing the ripples with her eyes, afraid that if she looked at him, she would shatter. I know this is a lot, Jack said, his voice calm and even. It was a voice used to soothing spooked animals, a low rumble that vibrated through the truck's cab. And I know I'm a stranger. Ellie flinched at the word. He was a stranger who had just wrapped his arm around her in front of the entire town and claimed her as his own. A stranger who had kissed her forehead with a tenderness that felt achingly real. She finally turned to face him, her hands clenched in her lap. His blue eyes were steady, holding none of the pity she was so used to seeing. They held something else. Resolve. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do that? She needed to understand the logic, the motive. People in her life didn't do things without a reason, and those reasons were rarely kind. You don't know me. You put yourself in the middle of all that. He didn't look away. I know you're the woman who runs the tailor shop. I know you say good morning to old Mr. Henderson every day, even when he's too grumpy to answer. And I know what I saw in that diner was wrong. He paused, letting the words settle. Isabella wanted an audience. She wanted to make a show of you. So I gave her a different one. It was so simple, so direct. It cut through the tangled mess of her humiliation and shame. Ellie shook her head, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. But to pretend, to lie to everyone, it's just more drama, more talk. I can't. Her voice broke. I just wanted to be quiet again. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp. She hated them, hated this weakness. Will it be quiet, Jack asked gently, or will they keep talking about the poor, abandoned bride, the one Thomas Ashford left behind, who's still here mending clothes while he lives his new, shiny life? Is that the story you want them to tell? His words weren't cruel. They were a bucket of cold, clear water. They were the truth she had been living for 5 years. The narrative had been written for her the day Thomas left that note. She was a tragedy, a cautionary tale whispered over coffee and pie. She remembered Isabella's crisp, condescending voice. She remembered the sea of faces in the diner, all looking at her with that awful, familiar pity. Thomas, refusing to meet her eyes, a coward then and a coward now. The burning shame felt like it was still crawling up her neck. Dignity, that was the word. She had been robbed of it, piece by piece, ever since her wedding day. Jack was offering her a chance to steal a piece of it back. It was a terrifying, reckless, and deeply tempting idea. What you're suggesting is crazy, she said, testing the weight of the word. We would have to be seen together. People would ask questions. Let them, Jack replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. We give them simple answers. We met a few weeks ago. We've been keeping it quiet. We're happy. He said the word happy as if it were the most normal thing in the world. For Ellie, it felt like a foreign country she had only read about in books. She looked down at her hands, at the tiny pinpricks on her fingertips. Her work was about creating things, about mending what was torn. But her own life felt like a garment ripped beyond repair. Maybe this was a different kind of mending. A temporary patch, perhaps, but a patch nonetheless. It was a lie, yes, but wasn't the story the town told about her also a kind of lie? It was a version of her that was frozen in time, defined only by her heartbreak. Just until they leave town, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Just until the talk dies down. It wasn't a question, it was a condition, a desperate plea for a finish line. Jack nodded, his expression serious. Just until the talk dies down, he agreed. This is about you, Ellie. About you walking down Main Street without feeling like every eye is on you with pity. I don't want anything from this. A strange bargain struck on a dusty road overlooking a quiet pond. A farmhand and a tailor, agreeing to construct a fiction. Ellie took a deep breath, the first one that seemed to reach the bottom of her lungs all day. Okay, she whispered, okay. The weekend farmer's market was the beating heart of Havenwood on a Saturday morning. The air was a chaotic symphony of smells, a blend of fresh-baked sourdough, sweet jam, earthy potatoes, and strong coffee. Sunlight streamed through the leaves of the old oak trees in the town square, dappling the crowd in shifting patterns of light and shadow. For Ellie, it had always been a place of quiet routine. Today, it felt like walking onto a stage without a script. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety. Every friendly hello, every curious glance felt magnified, dissected. Jack met her near the entrance, by the flower stall bursting with colorful zinnias and sunflowers. He wasn't wearing his usual dusty farm clothes. He had on a clean dark green Henley that brought out the blue of his eyes, and jeans that weren't covered in dirt. He looked solid, dependable. He gave her a small, reassuring nod as she approached. Morning, O'Shea, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Ready for this? She was not ready. She felt like a fraud, a child playing dress-up. No, she answered honestly, her fingers twisting the strap of her canvas tote bag. I feel like I have a giant sign over my head that says liar. He smiled, a genuine crinkling at the edges smile that momentarily stunned her. Good, nerves look real. He gestured towards the stalls. Let's just buy some vegetables. People who are in love buy vegetables, right? The absurdity of it made a tiny bubble of laughter escape her lips. It was a rusty, unused sound. It felt good. He offered her his arm. After a beat of hesitation, she took it. His forearm was warm and solid under her hand. It felt like an anchor. Their progress was slow. They were a new curiosity. Sarah, her friend from the bakery, saw them from behind her table of pastries, and her jaw literally dropped. She gave Ellie a frantic, questioning look over the heads of her customers. Ellie could only offer a weak, shaky smile in return. She could already imagine the phone call she would be getting later. Mrs. Gable, the town librarian, walked past them, her sharp eyes taking in their linked arms. She paused, and for a moment Ellie expected a lecture. Instead, the older woman gave her a slow, deliberate nod of approval, a silent message that said, "It's about time." The town's perception was a physical force, a current she had been fighting against for years. Now, with Jack by her side, the current seemed to be shifting. The whispers she half heard as they passed were different. There was less pity, more surprise. Is that Eleanor Vance? Who is he? He works out at Blackwood Farm, I think. Well, good for her. Each comment was a small stone being lifted from the mountain of weight on her shoulders. Jack was a natural. He steered her through the performance with an effortless grace. He pointed at a lumpy, misshapen heirloom tomato. That one looks like it has a personality, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. She found herself smiling. He haggled gently with the farmer over the price of a bag of apples, his manner easy and familiar. He bought them a coffee from a small cart, and when he handed her the steaming paper cup, his fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, small but sharp, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. She glanced up at him, but he was just looking at her, his expression unreadable. He led her to a bench near the fountain to drink their coffee. For a few minutes they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the town buzz around them. The sun was warm on her face. The coffee was hot and strong. Jack's presence beside her was a quiet wall, shielding her from the curious stares. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced out in public for a very long time. She was still anxious, still aware of the lie they were performing. But underneath it, a new feeling was taking root. Defiance. She wasn't the town tragedy today. She was a woman on a bench drinking coffee with a handsome man. It was a simple, beautiful fiction. "You're good at this," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "Pretending." He took a slow sip of his own coffee. "It's not about pretending to be someone else," he said, his gaze on the crowd. "It's just about choosing which part of yourself you let people see." He turned his head to Tainan, and his blue eyes met hers. "You've been letting them see the sad part for a long time. Maybe it's time to let them see the part that fights back." His words struck a chord deep inside Shin. He saw a fight in her that she thought had died years ago. He saw a strength she had forgotten she possessed. In that moment, sitting on a park bench with a man she barely knew, Ellie felt a flicker of the person she used to be before the unfinished wedding dress, before the note, before the pity. It was a fragile spark, but it was there. As they stood up to leave, a comfortable quiet having fallen between them, Ellie felt a wave of something that almost felt like hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so hard. Maybe this could actually work. She laughed at something he said, a real unforced laugh this time, as they walked toward the edge of the square. Her tote bag was filled with apples and tomatoes, and her hand no longer felt strange on his arm. It felt right. And that's when she saw him. Across the square, standing alone by the stone archway that led back to Main Street, was Thomas. He wasn't with Isabella. He was just standing there, watching them. His expensive suit looked out of place amongst the casual weekend crowd. His face, usually so full of easy charm, was a mask of complex emotions. It wasn't the simple anger or annoyance she might have expected. It was disbelief, that much was clear. His brow was furrowed, his mouth a tight, hard line. But there was something else in his eyes, something that twisted in her shwun, a flicker of possessiveness, a shadow of a something that looked unnervingly like regret. It was the look of a man who had discarded a treasured object, only to see it shining in someone else's hands. The air went cold. The sounds of the market faded into a dull roar in her ears. She stopped walking, her hand tightening on Jack's arm, without her realizing it. The fragile piece of the morning shattered into 1,000 pieces. This was not over. This performance, this brave, reckless lie, had not made him go away. It had made him look. And he was not looking at her with indifference. He was looking at her like she was still, somehow, his to lose. The memory of the farmer's market lingered long after the stalls were packed away. For Ellie, it was the surprising warmth of Jack's hand on her back, guiding her through the crowd. It was the shared, nervous glance over coffee that felt more genuine than it had any right to be. For Thomas Ashford, it was an image that burned behind his eyes. He had watched them from across the square, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He saw Ellie laugh, a real, unburdened laugh he hadn't heard in years. And she was laughing with a man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, a man whose hands were calloused from labor, not soft from counting money. Isabella had noticed his distraction, her sharp voice cutting through his thoughts. She called the man a nobody, a farmhand. She dismissed Ellie as pathetic, desperately clinging to the first man who showed her any attention. Thomas had agreed, but his agreement was hollow. He saw something else. He saw the easy way the man stood beside her, a quiet protector. He saw the way Ellie leaned into that presence, as if she belonged there. A hot, possessive anger, an emotion he had no right to feel, coiled in his gut. This was not how the story was supposed to go. He was the one who left. She was the one who was supposed to remain a sharp-eyed, beautiful memory in a town he had outgrown. She was not supposed to find happiness without his permission. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Ellie. The whispers in town had changed their tune. Pity had been replaced by a buzzing curiosity. Mrs. Gable from the bakery no longer gave her Shemuel knowing looks. Instead, she asked with a conspiratorial smile if Jack would be coming by the shop. Ellie would blush and give a non-committal answer, the lie feeling both heavy and wonderfully light on her tongue. The performance was working. For the first time in 5 years, she felt like she was the author of her own story, not a character in a tragic town legend. She was no longer just the jilted bride. She was the woman with the mysterious, handsome new man. She found herself thinking of Jack at odd hours. While threading a needle, she'd remember the startling blue of his eyes. While steaming a dress, she'd recall the low, steady timbre of his voice. Their arrangement was a simple pretense, a shield. But beneath the shield, something fragile and real was beginning to grow. She had agreed to this to reclaim her dignity, to escape the shadow of Thomas. She had not expected it to feel like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a stuffy room for years. She hadn't expected to like it so much. It was a Tuesday evening when her fragile new world was threatened. The sun had bled below the rooftops of Main Street, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Ellie was locking the front door of Stitches and Dreams, the little bell above it giving a final soft jingle. The street was quiet, most of the other shops already dark. She turned, her keys in her hand, and her heart seized. He was standing there, leaning against the brick wall next to her shop, half hidden in the growing dusk. Thomas. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was the confrontation she had rehearsed in her nightmares 1,000 times, the one she had always imagined ending with her in tears, running away. His expensive suit looked out of place in the fading light. The scent of his cologne, a fragrance she once associated with promises and affection, now felt cloying and predatory. He pushed off the wall and took a step toward her. His smile was the same one that had once made her heart flutter. Now it just made her stomach twist. "Ellie," he said, his voice smooth and low, "I was hoping I'd catch you. We need to talk." Her first instinct was to flee, to unlock the door and lock herself inside her shop, her sanctuary. Her fingers tightened around her keys, the metal biting into her palm. She could feel the old shame rising, the familiar heat crawling up her neck. She was the girl he left at the altar. She was nothing. "There's nothing to talk about, Thomas," she managed to say. Her voice was a thin, reedy thing, and she hated how weak it sounded. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "Don't be like that," he said, his tone softening, turning persuasive. "I saw you at the market with that guy." He said the word guy as if it were something distasteful. "I'm worried about you, Ellie." "Who is he? You can't seriously be involved with a common farmhand." The condescension in his voice was a slap. He was worried about her. After 5 years of absolute silence, he was suddenly worried. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The old Ellie would have shrunk. She would have believed he was right, that she was making a fool of herself. But then, an image flashed in her mind. Jack, standing beside her at the farmer's market. His quiet confidence. The way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a steady, unwavering respect. The feeling of his hand on her back. A simple gesture that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." That memory was an anchor in the swirling sea of her anxiety. This fake relationship had given her something real after all. It had given her a spine. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his. "You don't get to be worried about me," she said, and this time her voice was stronger. It didn't tremble. "You lost that a long time ago." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He wasn't expecting this. He was expecting the timid, heartbroken girl he had abandoned. "Ellie, I know I hurt you," he began, trying a different tactic. He reached out as if to touch her arm. "But that was years ago. I was young, I was stupid. Seeing you with him, it just doesn't seem right. It feels like you're settling, trying to prove a point." "The only thing I'm trying to do is live my life," she said, taking a step back, away from his reach. "My life, which for the record, is none of your business. Who I'm with, what I do, it has nothing to do with you anymore." Each word was a liberation, a brick being removed from the wall that had been built around her heart. She was talking back to the ghost that had haunted her for half a decade. And the ghost was just a man, a selfish, handsome man in an expensive suit who looked confused that she was no longer afraid of him. His charm was failing, and frustration began to color his features. "So it is serious? You and him?" he pressed, his voice losing its smooth edge. "I can't believe it. After us, after everything we planned, you choose someone like him?" He still thought he had a claim on her. He still saw her life only in relation to his. The sheer arrogance of it finally extinguished the last embers of her fear, replacing it with a cold, clear anger. "Yes, Thomas, I chose him," she lied, and the lie felt like the truest thing she had ever said. "He's a good man, he's kind, and he's honest. He doesn't make promises he can't keep. The words hung in the air between them, a direct hit. Thomas's face darkened. The charismatic mask fell away, revealing the ugly petulance beneath. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his composure gone. He stepped forward again, his hand shooting out and grabbing her wrist. It wasn't violent, but it was firm, a gesture of ownership. "Listen to me, Ellie. I think the lady asked you to leave her alone." The voice was not loud. It was calm, low, and it cut through the tension like a knife. Both Ellie and Thomas froze. Standing at the edge of the sidewalk, bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp that had just flickered on, was Jack. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He seemed to have materialized from the evening shadows, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. But his eyes, fixed on Thomas's hand on Ellie's wrist, were anything but relaxed. They were chips of ice. Thomas dropped her arm as if it were burning. He straightened his suit jacket, trying to regain some semblance of his polished authority. "This is a private conversation," he said, attempting to sound dismissive. Jack didn't even look at him. His gaze moved to Ellie, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her. "Everything okay here, Ellie?" he asked, his voice gentle. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight with a wave of immense relief. He was here, it was part of their arrangement, that he would walk her home some evenings to keep up appearances. But his timing was uncanny, it was perfect. Jack took a slow step forward, his boots making a soft sound on the pavement. He stopped beside Ellie, creating a silent, solid wall between her and Thomas. He still wasn't looking at Thomas, but his presence filled the space, demanding all the attention. The air crackled with unspoken challenge. Thomas, who commanded boardrooms and charmed investors, seemed to shrink under the weight of the farmhand's quiet disapproval. "We were just finishing up," Thomas said, his voice tight. He glanced from Jack's unreadable face to Ellie's resolute one. He had lost. He knew it. He had come here to reassert his power, to put her back in her place, and he had failed spectacularly. He gave a stiff, formal nod. "Ellie," he said, the name sounding foreign on his tongue now. Then, without another word, he turned and walked quickly down the street, his expensive shoes clicking in angry rhythm on the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. The silence he left behind was profound. The only sounds were the distant chirp of crickets and the unsteady beat of Ellie's own heart. She was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up with her. She had done it. She had faced him, and she had won. But she knew she hadn't done it entirely alone. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Jack. He finally turned his full attention to her, his blue eyes searching her face in the dim light. "He had no right to touch you," he said simply. There was no judgment, just a statement of fact. A fierce, protective quality in his tone made her feel safer than she had in years. "I know," she said, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. I think I finally know that now." He nodded once. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you home." They began to walk, falling into a comfortable silence. The evening air was cool on Ellie's flushed cheeks. The streetlights cast long, dancing shadows ahead of them. She was acutely aware of the space between them, a space charged with everything that had just happened and everything that remained unsaid. Her mind was racing, replaying the scene, Ifoen, his arrival, the look in his eyes, the way Thomas had crumbled without Jack needing to raise his voice. He had defended her. Not because he had to, not even because it was part of their deal. He had defended her because he believed she deserved to be defended. As they turned onto her residential street, lined with quiet houses and sleeping gardens, his hand moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting, tentative contact. A jolt, sharp and warm, shot up her arm, straight to her heart. It was a spark in the twilight, a sudden, shocking burst of feeling that had absolutely nothing to do with any pretense. As they walked away, Jack's hand lightly brushed hers, and the jolt of electricity was anything but fake. The feeling lingered long after he was gone. It was a ghost of warmth on the back of her hand, a tiny spark where his skin had met hers. Ellie replayed the moment as she locked the front door of her small house, the click of the bolt echoing in the quiet entryway. The walk from her shop had been a strange mixture of comfort and tension. Jack had walked beside her, their shoulders occasionally brushing, creating a silent conversation their words couldn't have. At her door, he had simply said goodnight, his blue eyes holding hers for a second too long before he turned and disappeared into the evening shadows. Now, alone in her kitchen, she made tea she didn't want, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. The jolt of electricity had been anything but fake. That was the problem. Their arrangement was supposed to be a shield, a simple piece of theater for the town's benefit. It was meant to protect her, to give her a wall to stand behind. But the wall was becoming a window, and she was starting to like the view on the other side. She was starting to like the feeling of not being alone. A few days passed in a blur of routine. The whispers in town had changed their tune. Pity had been replaced by a buzzing curiosity. Ellie felt a shift whenever she went to the bakery for her morning coffee. The glances were no longer sympathetic. They were speculative, intrigued. It was a strange sort of power, this shared fiction with Jack. It gave her a confidence she hadn't felt in 5 years. But with it came a deep, unsettling flutter in her chest whenever she thought of him, which was becoming far too often. She threw herself into her work, the familiar rhythm of needle and thread a welcome distraction. A large order for bridesmaid dresses needed her full attention, and late one evening, the shop was a sea of soft lilac fabric. The only light came from the small lamp over her antique sewing machine, the one her grandmother had taught her on. It hummed along faithfully, its steady stitch a comforting sound in the deep quiet of the night. Then, with a sudden jarring clunk, the needle seized. The motor whined in protest. Ellie's foot lifted from the pedal. She tried again. Nothing, just a metallic grinding sound that made her teeth ache. A knot of panic tightened in her stomach. This machine was the heart of her business. It was an old, sturdy thing, but when it broke, it required a specialist she couldn't afford and couldn't wait for. She spent the next hour with a tiny screwdriver and a flashlight, her frustration mounting with every failed attempt to find the problem. The gears were jammed tight. She finally slumped back in her chair, pressing the heels of her hands into her tired eyes. The lilac fabric seemed to mock her from the cutting table, a reminder of a deadline she might now miss. Defeated, she looked out the large front window onto the empty main street. The town was asleep, except for a single warm light glowing from the Havenwood Diner across the way. They always left a light on for the early bakers. The sight made her feel even more alone. Then, a memory surfaced. Jack's excuse in the diner. "Sorry I'm late, honey. The tractor gave me some trouble." He worked with farm equipment. He fixed things. The thought was a tiny flicker of hope. But could she ask him? It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Their arrangement was for public appearances, for fending off Thomas and Isabella. It wasn't for late-night emergency repairs. Calling him felt like crossing an invisible line, admitting a need that had nothing to do with their pact. It felt too real. She stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over his name. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What was she so afraid of? Hearing his voice? Him saying no? Or worse, him saying yes? She took a deep breath and pressed the screen. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Ellie?" His voice was low and calm, not sleepy, as if he'd been expecting a call. "Jack, hi, I'm so sorry to bother you this late," she began, her own voice sounding thin and rushed. "It's no bother. Is everything all right?" There was an immediate note of concern in his tone that both soothed and unnerved her. She explained the situation quickly, feeling foolish. "My old sewing machine is jammed. It's an antique and I can't figure it out. You mentioned fixing a tractor and I just thought, maybe you knew about motors." She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by the presumption. There was a short pause on the other end. "I know a little," he said. "Stay put. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Before she could protest or apologize again, he had hung up. Ellie stared at the phone in her hand, her mind racing. He was coming. He was coming here, to her shop, late at night. She suddenly saw the space through his eyes, the messy piles of fabric, the stray pins on the floor, the half-eaten sandwich on a plate by her cutting table. She scrambled to tidy up, stuffing scraps into a bin and wiping down the counter. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to smooth the messy bun she'd twisted it into that morning. Why did she care? This was just a favor, a friendly gesture. But her pulse refused to slow down. This felt different. There would be no audience tonight, no town to perform for, it would just be the two of them. True to his word, exactly 10 minutes later, the headlights of his truck swept across the front of her shop. She unlocked the door just as he reached it. He wasn't wearing his usual dusty farm clothes. He had on a pair of dark jeans and a simple gray Henley that fit snugly across his shoulders. He smelled clean, like soap in the cool night air. The scent of hay and earth was gone, replaced by something far more personal. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," he replied, his eyes doing a slow, curious sweep of her shop. The space seemed to shrink with him in it, becoming warmer, more intimate. "Let's see the patient." He smiled slightly, and the gesture eased some of the tension in her shoulders. She led him to the back where the old machine sat under the harsh glare of the work lamp. He pulled up a stool beside hers and leaned in, his focus immediate and absolute. "My grandmother bought it in 1965, Ellie found herself saying, filling the quiet. "She said it was built like a tank. It's never done this before." "Even tanks need a little help sometimes," Jack murmured, his gaze fixed on the machine's inner workings. He asked her for tools, and she handed him screwdrivers and small wrenches from a tin box. Their fingers brushed as she passed him a tool, a fleeting contact that sent another one of those jolts through her. He worked with a quiet, confident competence. His large, calloused hands, which she'd only ever seen gripping a steering wheel or a coffee cup, moved with surprising dexterity among the tiny, delicate parts. He didn't seem to need to think. His movements were intuitive and sure. Ellie watched, fascinated. She pointed out the flywheel and the tension discs, explaining their functions. They were so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm and see the faint lines around his eyes as he concentrated. The only sounds were the soft clink of metal on metal, his low questions, and the hum of the streetlights outside the window. The world outside the shop faded away, leaving only this small, brightly lit circle of shared purpose. "So, this is where you create all the magic," he said, not looking up from his work. Ellie felt a blush creep up her neck. "I mostly just mend things, hems, buttons, torn seams." "Mending is its own kind of magic," he countered, carefully removing a small metal plate. "Putting things back together, making them whole again." He glanced at her then, and his words seemed to hold a double meaning that hung in the air between them. To break the sudden intensity, she asked, "And you? Did you always fix tractors before you came to Havenwood?" He paused his work for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I've fixed a lot of things," he said vaguely. "Grew up in a place with more engines than people. It was loud, complicated. I always preferred working on things I could understand, things that had clear-cut problems and logical solutions." He carefully wiped a gear with a cloth. "People aren't always so logical." She heard the wall in his words, the careful barrier around his past. He wasn't telling her everything, but what he did share felt honest. He had come from somewhere loud and complicated and sought out the quiet and simple. She understood that feeling more than he could ever know. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "Sometimes I dream of just designing, creating dresses from scratch, things that are beautiful right from the start, that don't need mending." She hadn't admitted that to anyone, the secret ambition she kept folded away like her most expensive silks. He stopped working and turned to look at her fully. "You should," he said, his voice earnest. "I bet they'd be amazing." His simple, unwavering belief caught her off guard. Thomas had always called her sewing a cute hobby. He'd never seen it as a dream, as a form of art. But Jack did. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of a stronger, more capable version of herself. He turned back to the machine. "Ah," he said after a moment, "here's our culprit." He used a pair of pliers to pull out a thick, tangled knot of thread that had wound itself deep inside the gears. It was a dark, stubborn knot that had brought the entire mechanism to a halt. He worked it free, and with a final pull, the knot came loose. He reassembled the parts with the same quiet efficiency, his movements economical and precise. "Try it now," he said, sitting by. Ellie held her breath and pressed her foot to the pedal. The motor whirred, and the needle began to move, stitching a perfect, even line into a scrap of fabric. A wave of immense relief washed over her. "You fixed it," she breathed, looking from the purring machine to his face. "Thank you, Jack. You have no idea what this means." "I'm glad I could help," he said, a genuine smile warming his features. Let me at least make you some coffee, she insisted, standing up. Or tea? It's the least I can do. Coffee sounds great, he agreed, his eyes following her as she moved toward the small kitchenette in the back corner of the shop. As she filled the kettle, the adrenaline from her panic and the relief of the fix began to fade, replaced by a keen awareness of him. He was still sitting on the stool, but he had turned to watch her, his presence filling the cozy silence of the shop. The air felt charged, different from before. The pretense was gone. This was just Ellie and Jack. When the coffee was ready, she brought two mugs back to the workbench. He took one, his fingers brushing hers again, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. The touch lingered. He took a sip of his coffee. You have a thread, he said, his voice suddenly husky. She reached up to her hair, confused. Where? Here, let me. He set his mug down and reached across the small space between them. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't just pluck the thread away. His fingers gently brushed against her temple, tracing the line of her hair as he located the small, dark strand clinging to a loose curl. The touch was feather light, but it sent a shock wave straight to her core. Her breath caught in her throat. Everything stopped. The hum of the machine, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of her own heartbeat. All of it faded into a roaring silence. She looked up at him, and his face was only inches from hers. His blue eyes were dark in the lamplight, searching her face, asking a question he didn't dare speak. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath, mixed with that clean night air smell. The entire world narrowed to the space between their lips. The line between their fake relationship and this terrifying, wonderful real moment had not just blurred, it had vanished completely. He leaned in slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Her eyes fluttered shut. A sharp, sudden rap on the glass of the shop door shattered the spell. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was brutally loud in the stillness. They sprang apart as if electrocuted, their heads whipping toward the front of the shop. Jack stood up so quickly, his stool scraped against the wooden floor. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Who on earth would be knocking on her door at this hour? A jumble of unspoken words and unfulfilled feelings hung in the air between them, thick and heavy with possibility. They exchanged a wide-eyed, startled look before turning in unison to face the dark shape silhouetted against the glass of the door. The air in the shop hung thick and silent after the knock on the door. The moment between Ellie and Jack shattered, leaving behind a humming, unspoken energy. It was just a customer, Mrs. Gable, wanting to know if her husband's coat was ready. Jack had stepped back, his expression unreadable, and excused himself into the cool night air. Ellie had finished with her customer, her hands moving with practiced calm, while her heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Now, alone, she traced the outline of the old sewing machine he had just fixed. His scent, a mix of hay and clean soap, still lingered near the workbench. The memory of his face, inches from hers, his blue eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name, was seared into her mind. For the first time in 5 years, she had allowed herself to feel the fragile beginnings of hope. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, like stepping onto thin ice and finding it held her weight. But happiness in a small town is a fragile commodity. It invites observation, and observation, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. Isabella Sterling Ashford felt her polished world tilting. She saw the way Thomas watched Ellie and Jack at the market. She noticed the small, genuine smile on Ellie's face, a smile she had never seen before. It was not the expression of a pitied, abandoned woman. It was the look of a woman who was chosen. This was an unacceptable shift in the narrative she had constructed. She had come to Havenwood to be admired, to be the symbol of Thomas's success. She would not be upstaged by a small-town seamstress and a man who looked like he wrestled hay bales for a living. Her campaign began not with a cannon blast, but with a series of quiet, poisonous whispers. She started at the Havenwood Diner, sitting in a booth with a perfectly bored expression, speaking to a friend on her phone in a voice just loud enough to carry. She spoke of her concern for that poor Tailor girl, how she was so vulnerable. She mentioned hearing a rumor about the new man, Jack Riley. Nothing concrete, just a vague, troubling story about him leaving his previous town rather abruptly. She let the words hang in the air, allowing the town's natural curiosity to do the rest. The seeds of doubt were sown over coffee cups and slices of pie. From the diner, the whispers crawled up Main Street. They seeped into the bakery, where Sarah heard it from a customer buying bread. They echoed in the hardware store and settled in the pews at church on Sunday. The story mutated with each telling. Jack was running from debt. No, he was running from a broken-hearted woman. Or perhaps it was something more serious, something the police were involved in. He was a drifter, a man with no roots, no past he was willing to speak of. The mystery that had once seemed romantic now began to take on a more sinister shade. Ellie first noticed the change in the way people looked at her. The pity was gone, replaced by a wary, calculating curiosity. Mrs. Gable, who had been so friendly just days before, now collected her husband's coat with a clipped tone. She asked Ellie if she was being careful, her eyes filled with a meaning that Ellie couldn't quite grasp. Later, another customer mentioned that it was always wise to know a person's history. Each comment was a small, sharp prick, like a stray pin she couldn't find. Sarah finally brought the whispers into the open. She came into the shop late one afternoon, her face clouded with worry. She sat on the small armchair by the window, twisting the strap of her purse. "Ellie," she began, her voice low, "I need to tell you something. And please don't be angry, but people are talking." Ellie stopped threading a needle, her fingers suddenly still. She knew this tone. It was the same one people had used 5 years ago. "They're talking about Jack," Sarah continued, unable to meet her eyes. "Isabella has been telling people that he's not who he seems, that he might have a criminal past." Ellie felt a cold dread mixed with a surge of anger. "That's ridiculous, Sarah. It's just Isabella. She's a cruel person trying to hurt me." "I know," Sarah said quickly. "I know it's a lie, but people are listening. They're saying he's a drifter, that he's hiding something. They're worried for you." Ellie put the needle down and turned to face her friend. "Jack is the kindest man I've met in years. He stood up for me when no one else would. I'm not going to let her poison this." But even as she said it, a tiny cold sliver of fear lodged itself in her heart. Jack was kind. He was protective. He was also a complete mystery. Her resolve was tested a few days later. She was closing the shop, the sun casting long golden shadows across the street. As she turned the key in the lock, a sleek silver car pulled up to the curb. Isabella stepped out, her high heels clicking on the pavement with sharp, deliberate sounds. She wasn't wearing her usual condescending smile. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "We need to talk," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Ellie's hand tightened on her keys. "I have nothing to say to you, Isabella." "Oh, I think you do," Isabella countered, stepping closer, invading Ellie's space. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. "I wanted to give you a friendly warning, woman to woman." Ellie stood her ground, her back against the solid wood of her shop door. "I don't need any warnings from you." Isabella let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't you? You have a disastrous habit of choosing the wrong men, Eleanor. First Thomas, who was smart enough to realize he was meant for bigger things. And now this farmhand." She said the word like it was something dirty. "Do you even know who he is? Or did you just fall for the first man who showed you a bit of attention after 5 years of being the town tragedy?" Each word was a calculated strike, designed to find her deepest insecurities. Ellie's face flushed with heat. "You don't know anything about him. Or me." "I know that men with no past are men who are running from one," Isabella hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I've had people look into him. Jack Riley doesn't exist before he showed up in Havenwood. No records, no history. It's like he just appeared out of thin air. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" She leaned in closer, her sharp eyes boring into Ellie's. "I heard a story about a man who matches his description, a man who swindled a family in the next state, a man who charmed a lonely woman and took everything she had." The accusation hung in the quiet evening air, ugly and poisonous. It was a lie, Ellie told herself. It had to be a lie, but the details felt so specific, so plausible. "He's not like that," Ellie managed to say, her own voice sounding weak and uncertain. Isabella smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of her lips. She knew she had landed a blow. Are you sure he's pretending? Just like you are. You two are playing house. A little game to make my husband jealous and to make you feel less pathetic. But games end, Ellie, and when this one does, he'll disappear just as quickly as he arrived. She paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering her final devastating strike. You'll be abandoned all over again. Only this time it won't just be a broken heart. It will be by a common liar, a criminal, and everyone will know you were foolish enough to fall for it twice. Isabella stepped back, her work done. She gave Ellie one last dismissive look, a look that said, "You are nothing." Then she turned, got back into her car, and drove away, leaving Ellie alone on the sidewalk. The streetlights flickered on, casting a pale, lonely glow. Ellie stood frozen, her keys digging painfully into her palm. The anger she had felt was gone, replaced by a deep, chilling dread. Isabella's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over. Men with no past are men who are running from one. Ask him why he really came here. She finally unlocked her door and stepped into the darkness of her shop. She didn't turn on the lights. She just stood there, surrounded by the familiar scents of fabric and lavender that had always brought her comfort, but tonight they offered none. She thought of Jack's kindness, his steady presence, the feeling of his hand on her back. She thought of the way he'd looked at her just before the knock on the door, a look that promised something real. But what was it built on? He had told her stories, but they were vague anecdotes, sketches without a background. He had never once spoken about his family, his hometown, or the life he had lived before he drove into Havenwood. She had been so grateful for his protection that she had never thought to question it. She had accepted his mystery as part of his charm. Now that mystery felt like a locked door. Isabella's words, as hateful as they were, had planted a seed of doubt, and in the fertile ground of Ellie's old fears, it was beginning to take root. She sank into the armchair, the silence of the shop pressing in on her. For the first time, she was forced to admit the terrifying truth. She was pretending to be in love with a man she did not know at all. Isabella's words were like shards of glass working their way under Ellie's skin. A drifter, a liar. Each phrase was a venomous dart, coiling in her stomach during the drive out of town. She passed the faded sign for Blackwood Farm, her heart hammering against her ribs. What if this quiet, steady man was just another phantom, another lie she had allowed herself to believe in? The thought was a cold stone in her chest. She pulled up the long gravel driveway, the crunch of tires unnervingly loud. She saw him near the red barn, his back to her, mending a fence. He wore his usual faded jeans and a flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up. He looked so jarringly normal that for a moment she felt foolish. She almost put the car in reverse. But the doubt was a splinter that had to be removed, no matter how much it hurt. She got out of the car, her legs unsteady. He must have heard the engine die because he stopped hammering and turned. The easy calm in his blue eyes was replaced by a sharp, immediate concern. He set the hammer down and started walking toward her, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ellie, what is it? What's wrong?" She stopped a few feet away, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold herself together. She couldn't meet his gaze. "I saw Isabella today," she began, her own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "She came to the shop." Jack said nothing, but she could feel his stillness, a sudden heavy tension in the air. She forced herself to look up, to face him. "She told me I was a fool to trust you, that you're a liar, a drifter with a hidden past." Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. He didn't rush to reassure her. He just held her gaze with a deep, weary resignation, the look of a man whose secrets had caught up with him. "Let's walk," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. He gestured toward a path leading to a gentle rise overlooking the fields. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had come for an answer. Silently, she fell into step beside him. He led her to an old oak tree at the crest of the hill. He leaned against its trunk, crossing his arms. He looked tired, older than she had ever seen him. "She's not wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't been honest with you, Ellie." Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the confirmation. "But not in the way she thinks," Jack continued, looking out over the valley. "My name isn't just Jack Riley." He paused, and the silence stretched on, thick with unspoken truths. It's Jack Riley Sterling. The name hung in the air. Sterling, like Isabella Sterling Ashford. The connection clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening jolt. Isabella, he said, confirming her dawning horror, is my stepsister. Ellie took an involuntary step back, a small gasp escaping her lips. This man, with his calloused hands and quiet ways, was connected to them? To that world of polished lies and casual cruelty? What? She whispered, the word feeling empty. Jack's expression was pained. My father was Arthur Sterling, he explained, his voice flat, reciting facts he had pushed down for a long time. After my mother passed away, he married Isabella's mother. My father and we didn't see eye to eye on anything. I saw his world as a cage. About 7 years ago, I walked away from it all. I took my mother's maiden name, Riley, and he took me out of his will. The story was delivered without self-pity, a stark history of a family fractured by wealth. Ellie's mind reeled. But why are you here? She asked, her voice trembling. Why Havenwood? Because of Thomas, Jack said, his gaze hardening. I heard Isabella was marrying some man no one in our circle had ever heard of. I didn't trust it. My father was gone, but she was now the face of his legacy. I felt a responsibility to make sure the man she was bringing into our family wasn't just a parasite. He looked at Ellie then, his expression softening with regret. I came to Havenwood to watch Thomas Ashford. I took the job at the farm because it was quiet. It gave me a way to observe him without anyone knowing who I was. The confession landed like a punch to the gut. It was all about them. It had always been about them. Thomas, Isabella, the Sterling fortune. She had just been scenery. A cold fury, sharp and clean, began to cut through her shock. So, the diner, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. That was just an opportunity? A move in your game? The memory of his arm around her, his voice cutting through Isabella's cruelty, was now tainted. No, he said, his voice firm and urgent. He closed the distance between them, his hands held up slightly. No, Ellie, that's what I have to make you understand. His blue eyes pleaded with her. My plan was just to watch. I saw you in town before that day. I told myself it didn't matter. But when I saw them corner you in the diner, when I saw that look on your face, my plan went up in smoke. It wasn't about Thomas or Isabella anymore. It was about you. The man who stood up for you wasn't a Sterling. It was just me, Jack. He took a deep breath. I told myself our arrangement was just a pretense, but that was a lie too. I stayed in Havenwood for you, Ellie. I think I have been staying for you since the moment I first saw you. His words should have been a comfort, but they were tangled in a colossal, complicated lie she couldn't separate from the truth. Her greatest humiliation, the defining trauma of her life, was just a chapter in their family saga. Thomas had left her to chase their money, and now Jack, Isabella's own stepbrother, had entered her life because of it. She was trapped in their orbit. The kindness he had shown her felt real. The spark between them felt real. But it was all born from a lie that connected him directly to the source of all her pain. She looked at him, at this man who was both a stranger and the closest person to her in the world. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the desperate hope that she would understand. But all she could feel was the icy chill of betrayal. She slowly shook her head, a single tear finally breaking free and tracing a cold path down her cheek. She took a step back, putting the space between them again. The trust she had so carefully, so tentatively placed in him crumbled into dust. The air at the Founders' Day picnic smelled of grilled burgers and cut grass. Ellie sat on a checkered blanket, watching Jack return with 2 cups of lemonade. He was Jack Riley, the farmhand. He was also Jack Riley Sterling, the heir who walked away. The two truths left a heavy silence between them that she didn't know how to break. Since his confession, every shared smile felt like a question. He said he stayed for her, but she felt like a character in a story she hadn't been allowed to read. She took the lemonade, their fingers brushing. The familiar jolt was there, but it was followed by a wave of cold uncertainty. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment he looked just as lost as she felt. Around them, Havenwood buzzed. People waved, their smiles now more curious than pitying. Jack's presence had changed the narrative. She was no longer the jilted bride. It was the very dignity she had craved, but it felt hollow because its foundation was a secret. Her breath caught in her throat. Across the lawn, she saw them. Thomas and Isabella were moving toward their blanket with a chilling sense of purpose. The joyful picnic noise faded, replaced by the frantic beating of Ellie's heart. She felt Jack tense beside her, his body becoming a silent shield. Thomas stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. His voice was louder than necessary, designed for an audience. "Ellie," he began, with false concern, "I'm sorry to do this here, but I can't stand by and watch you make another mistake." Conversations nearby faltered. Heads began to turn. "What do you want, Thomas?" Jack's voice was low and even. Thomas ignored him, his eyes fixed on Ellie. He pointed a finger at Jack. "This man is a liar. He has been deceiving you. He has been deceiving this entire town." Isabella smirked, folding her arms to watch the show. "He's not some simple farmhand, Ellie. He's a nobody with nothing to his name." The accusation hung in the air. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. She waited for Jack to deny it, to fight back. But he didn't. He slowly got to his feet, his movements deliberate. He looked not at Thomas, but at the ring of curious faces that had begun to form. Then his gaze found Ellie's and held it. "He's right," Jack said, his voice was carrying with startling clarity. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. "About how it started. Our relationship began as a lie. I saw someone being cornered, hurt by people who only care about themselves." His eyes flickered to Thomas and Isabella, cold and sharp. "So I stepped in. That part was a pretense." He took a step closer to Ellie, his body blocking her from the crowd. He spoke directly to her now, his voice an intimate murmur. "But what happened after that was not. Getting to know you, seeing your strength, your kindness, falling for you, Ellie. That is the most real thing that has ever happened in my life." Tears stung her eyes. It was the truth, raw and unvarnished, offered up in the most public way. He then turned, his focus shifting to a stunned Isabella. "As for the rest of it," Jack announced, his voice ringing with authority, "I am Jack Riley. The sterling name, the sterling fortune, you can have it. I want no part of a family that measures a person's worth by their bank account." He looked back at Ellie, a world of meaning passing between them. "I found something infinitely more valuable." Every eye was on Ellie. The choice was hers. She saw Thomas's face, a mask of desperate self-righteousness. He was only trying to save himself. Then she looked at Jack. He had lied about his name, but he had just told the entire town the deepest truth of his heart. He had stripped himself of everything, right here on the grass for her. Slowly she rose to her feet. She closed the distance between them and slid her hand into his. His fingers, calloused from work, wrapped around hers, warm and solid. It felt like coming home. She turned her gaze to Thomas, and for the first time she felt no pain, only a profound and final clarity. "You're right, Thomas. He did lie," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But his lie was an act of kindness. Your truth was a note you left on a church pew." The color drained from Thomas's face. "You taught me that a big fortune can hide a very small person." She squeezed Jack's hand. "Jack showed me what it looks like when a man's character is his fortune. So yes, I choose him. I choose this man." A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd, not of judgment, but of respect. Thomas stood exposed and defeated. Isabella, however, was not silent. Her composure finally shattered. She turned on her husband, her voice a venomous hiss. "You incompetent fool, I knew you couldn't do it. You are weak." Thomas snapped, his own anger boiling over. "This was your idea, your paranoid obsession from the moment we arrived." "Because you were still looking at her," Isabella shrieked, her voice cracking. "I saw it. Everyone saw it." "Maybe if you weren't so insecure, you wouldn't have to buy your husband," he shot back. Their argument spiraled, vicious and personal, right there in the middle of the picnic. The whispers of the crowd grew louder as the couple's gilded cage fell apart, bar by bar. After the Founders' Day picnic, a strange quiet settled over Havenwood. The storm had passed. The whispers that followed Ellie Vance down Main Street for 5 years did not disappear, but they changed their tune. Pity was replaced by a murmur of respect. The story was no longer about the girl Thomas Ashford left at the altar. It was about the woman who had stood her ground, chosen her own happiness, and watched her past crumble under the weight of its own emptiness. In the week that followed, there was no grand confrontation. There were no more public scenes. Instead, a simple for sale sign appeared on the lawn of the new ostentatious house on the edge of town. It was hammered into the pristine grass on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, a moving truck arrived before dawn and was gone by noon. Thomas and Isabella Ashford left Havenwood as quietly as they had arrived loudly. They slipped away, not with a bang, but with the silent closing of a door, their brief, disruptive reign over Ellie's peace ending without ceremony. The town barely seemed to notice, already turning its attention to the upcoming Harvest Festival and the high school football season. Their drama had become insignificant, a forgotten footnote. For Ellie, their departure felt less like a victory and more like the release of a breath she had been holding for years. She felt the knot in her stomach. The one that had been her constant companion finally began to loosen. She spent her days in the shop, the familiar rhythm of the sewing machine, a comforting hum. She spent her evenings with Jack. They were simple evenings, filled with shared meals, long walks through fields smelling of hay and damp earth, and conversations that were easy and unforced. He never pressed her about her past, and she found she no longer wanted to dwell on it. With him, the present was far more interesting. He would walk her home from the shop each night, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. The touch was no longer a jolt of electricity, but a steady, grounding warmth. It was a promise, spoken in the language of calloused palms and intertwined fingers. One evening, as they stood on her porch beneath a sky full of stars, he looked at her, his blue eyes serious in the dim light. He said, "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie." It was not a grand declaration. It was a statement of fact, as solid and dependable as the man himself. And for the first time, she believed it without a single thread of doubt. A few nights later, Ellie was alone in her shop long after she had turned the open sign to closed. The street outside was deserted, the only light coming from the moon and the single lamp glowing over her cutting table. She had finished her last order, a hem on a prom dress for a local teenager. The shop was tidy, bolts of fabric neatly stacked, the air thick with the scent of lavender and steamed cotton. But her work did not feel done. There was one last task, one final seam to attend to. Her gaze drifted to the back room, to the cedar chest that had sat there for 5 long years. It was a silent monument to a day that had nearly broken her. Inside it lay the ghost of the woman she was supposed to become. For years, the thought of opening it filled her with a cold, paralyzing dread. It was a tomb, and she was terrified of disturbing the remains of her old life. But tonight was different. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet resolve. She walked into the back room, the floorboards creaking softly under her feet. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood of the chest. It did not feel like a coffin anymore. It just felt like a box. Taking a deep breath, she knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and preserved silk rose to meet her, a fragrance of arrested time. There it was, the unfinished wedding dress. It lay nestled in layers of tissue paper, the white lace glowing in the dim light. The bodice was fully beaded, but the skirt was still pinned, a cascade of silk and tulle waiting for stitches that never came. The pins, still shiny, looked like tiny silver thorns. She remembered the hours she had spent on it, her fingers pricking as she sewed pearls onto the neckline, her heart full of a naive, hopeful love. She had poured all of her dreams into that dress. Slowly, she reached in and touched the lace. It was delicate, intricate, a pattern of swirling leaves and blossoms. It was beautiful. A wave of sadness washed over her, not for the lost marriage, not for Thomas, but for the girl who had so lovingly crafted this creation, the girl who had believed so completely in a fairy tale. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of farewell, a quiet goodbye to a younger, more fragile version of herself. She did not hear the shop bell jingle. She did not hear the soft footsteps approaching the back room. She only knew he was there when a warm, strong hand came to rest on her shoulder. She looked up and saw Jack standing over her, his expression full of a gentle, unwavering understanding. He did not ask what she was doing. He did not look surprised or alarmed. He simply knelt beside her, his presence a silent anchor in the sea of her emotions. "I thought I should burn it," she whispered, her voice thick. "For years I thought one day I would find the strength to take it out to a field and set it on fire. I thought that's what healing was supposed to look like. A big, dramatic fire." Jack's gaze fell to the dress, then back to her face. "And now, Visto?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Ellie looked back at the dress, at the exquisite lace she had sourced from a tiny shop 3 towns over. She looked at the hundreds of tiny pearls she had sewn by hand. It was not a symbol of Thomas's betrayal. It was a testament to her own skill, her own heart, her own artistry. To destroy it would be to destroy a part of herself, a part that deserved to be reclaimed. "Now," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I think that's a waste of beautiful lace." A slow smile spread across Jack's face, reaching his eyes. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "What are you going to do?" Ellie took a steadying breath. "I'm going to unmake it." She carefully lifted the dress from the chest. It was heavy with beads and broken promises. She carried it out to her main work table, spreading the silk and tulle across the wide wooden surface. It looked ethereal under the bright work light, a fallen angel's wing. For a moment, she just looked at it. Then she opened a drawer and took out her sharpest seam ripper. Jack pulled up a stool and sat nearby, not speaking, simply watching. He was her witness. His quiet support gave her the courage she needed. Her hand was steady as she found the first seam connecting the lace bodice to the silk skirt. She slid the sharp point of the tool under the first tiny stitch. There was a soft ripping sound, the sound of a single thread breaking. Then another, and another. She worked with the same meticulous care she gave to all her projects. This was not an act of destruction. It was an act of deconstruction. She was not tearing it apart in anger. She was carefully liberating the valuable parts from the painful whole. With each undone stitch, she felt a little lighter. She was unpicking the past, one thread at a time. She was separating the girl she had been from the woman she was now. An hour passed in near silence, filled only by the whisper of breaking threads and the hum of the streetlights outside. The bodice was finally free from the skirt. Ellie laid it aside, a piece of art in its own right. She started on the long seams of the skirt, her movements practiced and sure. Jack finally spoke, his voice soft in the quiet room. "My father built his business from nothing," he said, and Ellie paused, looking at him. "He loved my mother, but he loved his work more. When she passed, he buried himself in it completely. He married Isabella's mother because it was a good merger, not because he loved her." He looked at the fabric in her hands. "I saw how that emptiness hollowed him out, how it made Isabella so desperate for validation that she'd cling to anything that looked like success. I came here to see if Thomas was just another version of that, another empty suit." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But I stayed because I saw you. I saw someone who was the complete opposite of all that. Someone real." Ellie's fingers stilled on the silk. She looked at this man, this quiet farmhand, who was so much more. He had seen her at her lowest, her most humiliated, and he had not seen a victim. He had seen her. She went back to her work, a new sense of peace settling over her. She was not a pawn in his family's drama. She was the reason he had chosen a different life. When she had salvaged all the lace, she folded it carefully and set it on a clean shelf. The remaining silk and tulle lay in a soft pile. It was no longer a dress. It was just fabric, full of potential, full of new beginnings. She finally put the seam ripper down and let out a slow sigh. It was done. She felt Jack's presence behind her before she felt his touch. He moved from the stool and stood behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. Then his arms wrapped around her, pulling her back against his chest. His chin rested on the top of her head. She closed her eyes, leaning into his embrace. It felt like coming home. The air in the shop was a perfect mix of her world and his. The familiar scent of lavender from her sachets mingled with the faint, earthy smell of hay that always clung to his clothes. Sunlight was just beginning to streak through the front window, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the pile of salvaged lace. It was the start of a new day. For the first time in 5 years, her heart felt completely mended. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.